Hey everyone, today we're going to be looking at taking a high poly ZBrush sculpt and exporting it to Blender. To do this, we're going to have to turn this over 2 million poly mesh into something much lower, maybe, 20K. We could even go lower if we wanted. It depends on, what you're using the model for. But yeah, we're going to be exporting this guy with all the applicable maps to Blender, so let's dive right in. As you can see, I have this base mesh model that I've been working on. It's not done, but I figured it would work to kind of illustrate how we can take something that's really dense and, trim it down to, something much lower poly and get it into Blender. So as you can see on the right here, we really only have two subtools, the body and the eyes. So I'm actually going to rename this subtool to eyes. All right, so we're going to start with the base mesh itself. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to duplicate it. We need a duplicate so we can transfer the high poly details onto the low poly model once the low poly model is created. So I'm going to rename this top one original so we don't get confused. And I'm going to rename the second one base export, so we know that this is going to be the subtool that gets exported. And I'll go ahead and I'll do that with the eyes too. So let's duplicate. Let's rename this one eyes underscore original. And you can call them whatever you want. This is just so we keep track and we know what they're going to be used for. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and hide the eyes because we don't need those right now. I'm going to take this base export model, which is still very high poly, and we're going to make this low poly now. So to do that, we're going to use ZRemesher. Let's go ahead and turn off the original, so that's not showing. Now make sure you have the export model selected. We're going to go down to geometry, and we're going to find ZRemesher. There's this tab right here, just click it, and we have various ZRemesher options. I've got another video explaining ZRemesher, but I'll give you a quick rundown here. So if you hit this button right here, it says Legacy 2018, this will use the old algorithm. ZBrush has updated its ZRemesher algorithm to do a much better job, but sometimes the old algorithm works good too, so sometimes you want to try that out as well. Right here, we can change the target polygon count. So, of course, the higher you have it, the more polys the ZRemesh model will have, versus if you slide it all the way down to the bottom, it'll be much lower poly. I'm going to leave it around 8. I'm going to leave adapt on, and I'm going to hit ZRemesher, and let's just kind of see what happens. Give it a second to run. It's calculating, and just give it a second to run. ZBrush is now calculating the low poly model from the high poly. Okay, so we can see we have a much lower poly model now. It's actually around 17,000 polys. But the topology is not very good, and we need additional polys in the face versus other areas. So let's just hit Control-Z. I'm going to go ahead and use ZRemesher Guides to kind of help with creating good topology. It doesn't have to be perfect because I'm not using this model as an animation, but we still want it to look pretty good. So we'll go to our brush palette. I'll press Z, and I can see ZRemesher Guides right here in the bottom. I'll click on that. Okay, so with ZRemesher Guides, we can kind of draw out the flow of polys the way we want it. So if I start with the mouth, you can see I draw a loop around the mouth, kind of like this. If I'm not happy with that, I can press the Alt button, and you can see the little minus sign has appeared now near my cursor, and I'll just draw a line through it. And that will delete the ZRemesher guide. If I want a smoother ZRemesher guide, I'll shrink the draw size. As you can see, this is a lot smoother. I like to add a few ZRemesher guides where I need additional support. So do that right there. I'll add some around the eyes. That one didn't turn out too good, so I'll Control-Z, back it out. Try it again. Okay. And let's see, maybe one more around the edge of the face. And I kind of want one around the ears to help preserve this shape. Let me redo that one. It didn't turn out very well. Okay. Let's try again. Let's hit ZRemesher and let's see what kind of result we have. Let's turn on the polyframe first though. Okay, so I'm not very happy with the way this turned out. Another thing I can do is, let's hit Control Z, and let's turn on Use PolyPaint. We'll set the color density to something like 3. Now, if we use PolyPaint, we can actually paint where we want a higher density of polys to be placed when ZRemesher is activated. So let's go to our standard brush. We'll make sure Z add is off, and we'll turn on RGB. We'll pick red. Now, if you use red, ZRemesher will make the polys more dense in the area that you paint red. If you use blue, it will put less polys in the area. So let's go ahead and paint the face red. Once again, it doesn't have to be perfect. We're just telling ZRemesher, hey, we want more polys here. And then we can actually use some kind of blue in areas that we don't really need as many polys, like right here. Okay, I'm also going to add a little bit of red to the hands because I feel like we need some more polys there to support the shape, especially with the fingers. Okay, let's go ahead and turn our polyframe back on. And let's run ZRemesher again. Okay, so ZRemesher is finished, and we can see that there are a lot more polys in the areas that we painted red. See, it's much more dense, especially around the ears. The flow of polys kind of matches the guides we set. You can see the circles around the eyes, and around the mouth, and around the ears. And I think this will do. The next thing we need to do is create UV maps for this mesh so that we can get the high poly details off of the original model. So we're going to go to Z plugin. We're going to find UVMaster from the list. You can see my settings right here. I've enabled control painting. I'll hit attract from ambient occlusion. This will attempt to put the UV seams in these ambient occlusion areas because they're kind of more hidden than, you know, right in the middle of the face or across the chest or something like that. So let's go ahead and let's unwrap and see what kind of result we get. Okay, I'm going to go to UV map and I'm going to click morph. Okay, so this is the result I got. If you're not happy, you can play with the control painting and you can attempt to get a different UV unwrap, but I think this is okay. So we've gone from multi-million polys to 31,000, which is okay. I mean, we could probably go lower, but this will be fine. And we'll do the same for the eyes now. So let's go ahead and hide this body. Let's go to my eyes export. And we'll do the same thing. We'll go to geometry and ZRemesher. This time, I'm just going to slide the slider all the way down to 0.1 because the eyes can be really, really low poly and we can get away with that. So let's run ZRemesher. For those of you wondering why the poly count is currently 1 million for the eyes, it was because I wanted a dense mesh to paint the eye detail. We're going to actually transfer this poly paint from the original eyes to the low poly eyes when we're done. Okay, so we went from 1 million polys to 212 for both of these eyes. I am okay with that. Okay, so let's go to Z plugin. Let's go to our UVMaster and let's enable control painting and attract from ambient occlusion. Let's go ahead and unwrap these eyes. We can also go to Z plugin and flatten to see the UVs. That's what we'll end up with. So let's unflatten, that's fine. Next, we need to start transferring the high poly detail onto these low poly models. Let's go back to the body. Okay, here's our low poly model. Hit the eye there to turn that on. And we can go down to geometry, and we'll divide this several times. I've gone up to 1.9 million polys because we do need to support the high level of detail from the other model. Now we can use the slider here and we can scroll between our different subdivision levels. So you can see if I scroll all the way to the bottom, I'm back down to 31,000 polys, scroll all the way to the top, I'm at 1.9 million. Let's go ahead and turn on the original. And if we switch between them, we can use solo mode here. This is our new model with the new topology. And I'll turn on polyframe so we can see that. Here's the new topology. Here's the old one. You can see the details on the old one are much better than the details on the new one. So what we need to do is transfer the details from here to here. Let's turn solo off. The way we can do that is go down to project. This is in the subtool menu. Make sure you have the new model selected. And this is basically going to take the details from any other visible model and project them onto the model that's selected. So let's hit project all. We'll let it do its thing. It's going to take a second. But when we're done, we'll see the high poly details from the original model will be on the new model. Okay, so as we can see, the high poly details have now been projected onto our lower poly model. And I know you're thinking, well, it's still 1.9 million polys. The difference is, under the geometry tab, we can actually slide this down, and now we're back to 31,000. Okay, let's go ahead and do the same for the eyes. And with the eyes, we're actually going to project the geometry detail and the PolyPaint. So let's turn off the original model and the export model. In fact, we can actually delete the original model. Now, I typically don't recommend this, but in this case, I'm going to delete it. Usually, I'll make a new folder called backup, which I can actually do right here, and just type backup, and I can slide that original mesh into that. But for the sake of the tutorial, I'm not doing that. So I'm just going to hit delete. And now we'll turn on both our eyes. Make sure solo is off. So here's the original and the new exported version. What I need to do is add more geometry here. So I'm going to hit Control D till we're back up to over 1 million polys. I'll turn the original eyes on and we will project all. Make sure that geometry and color are turned on. Otherwise, if you don't have color selected, it won't project the PolyPaint details. So let's hit project all. All right, so let's go into solo mode. We can see here's the new eyes and there's the original, and there's pretty much no difference. So I'm going to delete the original eyes like we did for the original base mesh. And let's turn them both on, and let's see what we got. We'll turn solo off. So we can see there's the model that we're basically going to export, except the lowest subdivision level of this. Okay, and so here we are. We now have two subtools with varying levels of geometry. We can now use these varying levels of geometry to make the maps needed to make the low poly model look basically good in Blender. So let's start with the base export model. So we'll pick the lowest subdivision level by sliding the slider down. We'll scroll down to normal map. And I basically just use the default settings. I'll hit create normal map. And basically this is going to compare the highest poly version to the lowest poly version and make a map between the two. Now, I actually prefer to use external bakers like Substance Painter or XNormal, I feel like they do a better job. But in this case, we're just using ZBrush and Blender, and this will work for what we want to do here. If you want to see how to do that, I have some additional videos on exporting ZBrush Substance Painter. Go ahead and check those out. All right, now we're going to go ahead and choose the eyes. We'll do the same thing. We'll do geometry. Lower the subdivision level to the bottom. We'll create the normal map. And now we'll go back to geometry, the highest level, and we will create our texture map. So go to texture map, create, new from PolyPaint. And this is basically going to take the PolyPaint from the eyes and make a map for them. Don't forget to lower your subdivision level back all the way down to the lowest level. And now we're going to export. So to export, we're going to go to Z plugin, and we're going to pick FBX export import. These are the settings I'm using. Visible, so basically only visible subtools will be exported. Bin and smooth normals. This will basically make the normals appear smooth in the export. Make sure all of these are deselected. We'll just hit export. So I'm just going to rename this to like model export. Give it a second to do that. Okay, so once it's done exporting, we can see that it's created the FBX file and a few TGA textures. We can see base export normal, eyes export normal, and eyes export texture. And that's basically correct, because we had PolyPaint only on the eyes, and then we had normal maps for the base and the eyes. Now it's time to get this model into Blender. Alright guys, so now I'm in Blender. We're going to go ahead and import our FBX file. Let's start off by deleting the default cube, of course. And I want to mention that this method actually works for both cycles and EV, so no matter what you're working with, you'll be good to go. We'll go to File, Import FBX. Alright, here is our file. Let's select it and import FBX. And now we can see it is incredibly tiny. That's because the scale is not the same between ZBrush and Blender. So let's go ahead and hit Control-Z and undo that import. Back out a little bit. We'll go back to File, Import, FBX. And I'm changing the scale to 100 because that was pretty tiny. You might have to play around with this depending on the size of your model and, just see what kind of works. So let's pick our model again, import FBX, and that is a lot better. I'm going to move him up a little bit. And yeah, so currently I'm set to EV. Let's see viewport shading. We can see that even though this is a pretty low poly model, the details came in pretty good. If I hold down Z and pick wireframe, we can see that this is the low poly wireframe. I'll go back to material preview, and if I pick render, you can see we're getting decent results. Of course, the lighting is bad. And we can also see that our eye material is there. The way this works is if I go to the shading tab, when the model is imported, it actually imports the texture maps for each subtool. So you can see here's the base export model. It only imported the normal map because that's all we had. We can actually adjust this a little bit and play around with it. Try and make it look a little bit better. We pick our eyes, and we can see it imported the PolyPaint as diffuse, and of course the normal map for the geometry. If we want to make this look a little better, we'll turn metallic down, we'll turn roughness down pretty low. And back to render. We can also switch between EV and cycles. You see now we're in cycles. That looks pretty good. If we want to improve the quality of this model, we can actually select it and we can add a subdivision surface modifier. And you can see that made a pretty big difference in how this looks. I'm just toggling it on and off here. This is without. That's with the modifier on. Also add a different light, maybe a sunlight. Here we'll reposition it so we can see our model a little bit better. And yeah, that's basically it, guys. We took a high poly, multi-million poly model from Zbrush and we made it relatively low, about 30,000 polys, imported into Blender, and we kept, you know, pretty much all the details. It looks pretty decent. That's about it. I hope this helped. If it did, please like and subscribe to this channel. Your support means a lot to me and helps me continue to make videos. So that's it. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.